The ship was not on any map that still existed. That was the first thing the broker told me when he slid the contract across his desk. He did not slide it like a man offering opportunity. He slid it like a man getting rid of something that had been sitting too close to him for too long. The second thing he told me was that 3 teams had already gone out to look at it. 2 came back. 1 did not. I signed the contract before he finished explaining. My name is Mara Voss. I fix things. That is the whole of me, if you strip everything else away. I grew up in the Detroit orbital yards where my mother welded hull plates by hand until her fingers forgot how to straighten, and I learned early that broken things were the only honest things in the universe. They did not pretend. They did not negotiate. They just waited for someone to come along who understood them well enough to make them whole again. The broker's name was Callow, and he looked like a man who had made a long career of not asking questions. He told me the vessel had been flagged on passive drift sensors 6 weeks ago, at the edge of the Veil Nebula. No transponder signal, no registered owner, no identification in any database, and he meant any database, not just the civilian ones. He had checked the Karathi Registry, the Dominari Collective Catalog, the Veil Concord's historical archive. Nothing. The ship existed outside of recorded galactic history, like a word in a language everyone had agreed to stop speaking. I asked him how big. He told me. I asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. I took my pen back from him and looked at the number he had written at the bottom of the manifest, and I did the math in my head 3 times, because I did not trust the first 2 answers. 2,000 kilometers. Not 200. Not 2,000 meters. 2,000 kilometers of vessel, drifting at the edge of a nebula that no shipping lane went near, in a region of space that even long-haul cargo pilots called the quiet place, and not in the way you call somewhere peaceful. I flew out in my salvage tug, the Copperhead, a vessel held together by my own repairs, and a philosophy of aggressive optimism. She was 40 meters long, and smelled like hydraulic fluid, and the particular kind of loneliness that lives inside small ships on long routes. I had made her as good as she could be. She was still, by most standards, a collection of jury-rigged solutions, wrapped around an engine that wheezed at full burn. It took me 11 days to reach the Veil Nebula's outer boundary, 11 days of nothing but the Copperhead's instruments and my own thoughts, which were not particularly good company. I thought about my last crew. I thought about the Karathi border and the way a hull sounds when it gives up. I thought about the 4 people I could not bring home and the way their names had settled into me like stones into water, heavy and permanent, and sunk too deep to reach. I stopped thinking about it. I fixed the secondary coolant relay instead. It did not need fixing. I fixed it anyway. The ship appeared on my long-range scanner at 300,000 kilometers, and it looked like a mistake. The scanner kept trying to frame it as a region of dense matter rather than a constructed object, because the human brain, even filtered through instruments, refuses certain information until it has no other choice. Then the resolution clarified, and I sat in my pilot chair for a long time without moving. 2,000 kilometers of dark metal, hanging in space with the patience of something that has been waiting long enough that it has forgotten urgency. The design was nothing like anything I knew. Not Karathi angles, not Dominari curves, not the blunt functionality of human construction. It was built the way a mountain is built, like something that had simply grown into the most structurally efficient expression of itself and stopped there. It had no visible weapon ports, no obvious engine nacelles, no bridge tower or command structure protruding from its surface. It looked complete in a way that made everything else I had ever seen look like a rough draft. I ran every scanner I had. Standard atmospheric analysis returned corrupted data, not absent, corrupted, as if something aboard was actively disagreeing with my instruments. Secondary structural scan returned the same. I tried the deep resonance probe, the one I used for locating stress fractures inside thick hull plating, and it came back with a single line of text in a writing system I had never seen before. 47 characters arranged in a pattern that my linguistics database rejected entirely. Then, below it, a translation appeared. Not from my database, from somewhere else. One word. Finally. I sat with that for a while. I told myself it was a corrupted output, a glitch in the translation subroutine producing a false positive from noise data. I told myself this with the same tone I use when a fuel coupling starts vibrating at a frequency it should not be capable of, and I decide to listen for it a little longer before I call it a problem. I docked at what looked like a maintenance port, a recessed section of hull that my docking arm found without difficulty, which was itself strange because I had not aimed for it. The copperhead settled against the ancient metal, and the magnetic clamps engaged, and something on the other side of the hull responded. A pressure equalization, a hiss of atmosphere cycling. Not my atmosphere cycling out, the ship's atmosphere cycling in. I suited up anyway. I am a practical woman. Inside was not what I expected, which was debris, decay, the wreckage of time. Inside was preserved. The corridors were tall enough for something considerably larger than a human, and the walls were a dark material that was not quite metal, not quite composite, something between the two that felt warm, even through my gloves, and had a very faint texture, almost like skin, though I did not linger on that comparison. The lights were off everywhere, except for one corridor. Amber light, steady, not emergency red, not the cold blue of backup power. Amber, like a lamp left on by someone who expected to come back. I followed it. Of course I did. The engine room was at the heart of the ship, behind a door that opened before I touched it, and what was inside made me stand still. In a way I have not stood still since I was 14 years old, and my mother showed me the inside of a fusion core for the first time, and told me this is what power looks like when it is resting. The drive system was unlike anything in my training, unlike anything in any technical manual I had studied, unlike anything described in any engineering journal I had read in 11 years of professional work. It was not fusion. It was not antimatter. It was something that looked, to my eye, like it was built on principles that human physics had not yet arrived at. I did what any competent mechanic does when they encounter unfamiliar machinery. I looked at it for a long time. I traced the visible pathways with my eyes. I identified the components I could understand by their function rather than their design, the things that cooled other things, the things that moved energy from one place to another, the things that regulated and monitored and adjusted. I built a mental map. Then, because I could not help it, because it is the same instinct that has driven me to fix every broken thing I have ever encountered, I reached out and put my hand on the central interface panel. The ship exhaled. Not metaphorically. A sound moved through the hull beneath my feet, through the walls around me, through the floor and ceiling, and the dark, warm material of the corridor behind me. A single long breath released by something enormous. The vibration I had detected on my scanners, that 0.0003 Hz pulse I had logged as probable tidal stress, moved through me like a current. The amber light in the corridor brightened. Then it moved. It did not travel in a line the way emergency lighting does. It shifted, a deliberate pointing, leading away from the engine room and deeper into the ship. I followed it through 3 corridors and 2 chambers that were so large my suit lamp could not find their far walls, and then I was standing on the bridge. The command interface rose from the floor. I did not touch it. It came to me. The panels arranged themselves at a height that suited a human body, and then something happened that I have spent a great deal of time since trying to describe accurately, and failing. It was not sound. It was not text. It was a pressure behind my eyes that was not painful, and a warmth in my hands that was not heat, and a question that had no words but had absolute clarity of meaning. Are you the one who fixes things? My voice, when I answered, sounded very small in that enormous space. Yes. Every system aboard the ship activated at once. Not with noise. With a feeling. 2,000 kilometers of dormant machinery waking up all around me, above me, below me, in every direction, a thing so large that its waking was less like a machine starting and more like a continent deciding to stand. The lights came up everywhere, the corridors filled with amber warmth. The hull plates I could not see adjusted themselves by degrees too small to measure, but perfectly perceptible to a woman whose hands have spent their adult life measuring things by feel. My comm unit connected automatically to the Copperhead system, and from there to the broker's relay, and I told Callow the contract was off. He did not take this news well. He told me about the Karathi restricted list, the Dominari watch list, the Vale Concords do not approach registry, which was itself interesting because the Vale Concord only put things on that list that they were afraid of, and they were not a species that frightened easily. He told me all of this in the tone of a man who has realized that the thing he sold is worth considerably more than the price he charged for it. Change of plans, I told him. I am keeping her. I cut the feed. Behind me, in a language I had not learned but was already beginning to understand the way you understand weather, by reading the sky. The ship said something. It did not feel like a threat. It did not feel like a warning. It felt like the sound a house makes when someone finally comes home after a very long winter. I stood on the bridge of a 2,000-kilometer warship that no species in the galaxy claimed to know, with my hands still warm from the contact of its interface, and I understood with the absolute clarity of a person who has been running from something long enough to recognize when they have stopped, that I was not going to leave. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until I understood every system in this ship down to the smallest component. Not until I had mapped every corridor and traced every power pathway and learned the name of every mechanism that kept this impossible vessel breathing. I am Mara Voss. I fix things. And this ship had been waiting a very long time for someone exactly like me. The ship's name, in its own language, was Azara. I called it Az from the second day, because I am a practical woman with practical habits, and Azara required a specific movement of the throat that I was not entirely sure a human mouth was designed to make. Az did not seem to mind. The lights would shift slightly when I used the shorter name, a warmth that moved through the amber corridors in the way a person's expression changes when they hear something that pleases them. I did not mention that observation in my personal log. Some things are more useful when you do not examine them too closely. By the third day, the communication system had evolved in a way that I had no technical framework to explain. Az was feeding me information not as text, not as translated audio, but as direct experience. I would stand at an interface panel and the knowledge would come, not like reading, not like listening, but like remembering something I had always known but never accessed. I dreamed in geometry that night. Three-dimensional structures rotating through spaces with more than 3 dimensions. Equations solving themselves in colors I did not have names for. I woke up and went straight to the engine bay and spent 4 hours working through what the dreams had told me. Az showed me the Veth on the 4th day. The archive was not stored in a data system I could have described to any engineer back home. It was built into the ship itself, into the material of its walls and floors, a living record encoded into the structure at a molecular level. Standing in certain rooms was standing inside a memory, the history of an entire civilization pressed against you from every direction at once like light. Veth were the first, not the first in any mythological sense, not the first in any specific region, but the first spacefaring species in this galaxy, full stop. They had been traveling between stars before the ancestors of the Karathi had developed agriculture, before the Dominari had discovered fire. They were engineers in a way that made every other species' engineering look like children stacking blocks, not from arrogance but from simply having had so much more time to think about it. They looked, from the records Az showed me, like something between a very tall human and a question that had not yet resolved itself. Thin, long-fingered, faces that changed expression in ways that suggested more emotional states than human faces had evolved to show. They built because they could not stop themselves from building. They fixed because the idea of leaving a broken thing broken was genuinely incomprehensible to them. I sat on the floor of the archive room and did not say anything for a long time. Az waited. It was very good at waiting. The Veth had built Azara as a last resort, not a first strike, not an aggressive weapon. A deterrent so complete, so far beyond anything any other species could match, that the logic of attacking the Veth would collapse under its own mathematics. Look at what they have, the Veth engineers had reasoned. Look at what you would be starting. Walk away. It did not work. 7 species formed a coalition with a name that translated roughly as the Precautionary Alliance, which was the most dishonest name I had ever heard for a thing that was purely and simply a decision to destroy something before it became impossible to destroy. They came while Az was still in its final construction phase. They came with numbers instead of technology, which is the oldest military strategy in existence, and frequently the most effective one. The Veth were caught at a moment when they were still building the thing that would have made them uncatchable. The Veth told Az to hide. Az hid. It drifted to the edge of the Veil Nebula and went silent and waited, because its creators had built into it a set of instructions it had been carrying for thousands of years, like a letter addressed to a person who had not been born yet. The instructions described a set of behavioral and biological markers, characteristics, a kind of person rather than a specific one, someone compatible, someone who would know what to do with the most powerful vessel in galactic history without being told, because the Veth had understood that telling the wrong person what to do with a thing like this was more dangerous than the thing itself. I was standing in front of the archive interface when Az showed me the prediction log. I want to be honest about what happened when I saw it. I did not collapse. I did not make a sound. I stood very still with my hands at my sides and breathed very carefully the way you breathe when you are doing precise work in a very small tolerance, and any sudden movement will ruin everything. The prediction log went back 11 years. My name was in it from the beginning. My crew's names were in it. Owen Marsh, who could fix a navigation array blindfolded. Claire Dutton, who laughed at things that were not funny, and made them funny by laughing. Sam Vieira, who had never once in 3 years of working together been on time for anything, and who I would give everything I owned to watch be late one more time. Diane Ford, who had been the best pilot I had ever seen, and who had, on the last day I saw her, flown straight at a Karathi cruiser to buy the rest of us time that turned out not to matter because I was the only one who used it. All 4 names, in a ship that had been drifting silently at the edge of a nebula for thousands of years. Recorded not as targets, not as casualties, but as markers, reference points, people whose existence Az had been tracking because they orbited around the person it was waiting for. Az had known about the border skirmish. Az had known what was going to happen. Az had been 17 days of travel away, and it could not reach us in time because it was not yet active, because it had been waiting for me to come to it, rather than the other way around, because the criteria required a willing approach, a choosing, and you cannot choose something you do not know exists. I stood in the archive room with my crew's names in front of me, and I thought about what it meant to know a thing was coming and not be able to stop it, and the thought was very familiar, and I did not examine it any further than that. Az did something then that I had not asked it to do. It did not show me their names again. It did not offer explanation or context or comfort. It simply showed me a star chart with a marker at the location of the skirmish site, and held it there for one moment, and then moved on to the next section of the archive. The way a person acknowledges something terrible by being very quiet about it. It carried the knowledge of what had happened, the way old machines carry damage, not broken, not repaired, marked. You can always tell a machine that has been through something by the way it holds the memory of it in its structure, a slight variance in the rhythm, a place where the tolerance is a little wider than it should be, something that learned to make room for what it could not change. I understood that. I went back to learning the ship's systems. Az taught me about the Veth drive, which did not move through space so much as it renegotiated the agreement between 2 points about how far apart they were required to be. It taught me about the sensor array, which did not detect the galaxy so much as it listened to it. 17,000 independent inputs processing simultaneously to build a picture of surrounding space down to the molecular level. It taught me about the weapon systems in a way that felt less like a briefing and more like Az introducing me to people it trusted. Here is this one, and here is what it does, and here is why the Veth built it this way, rather than some other way. I was in the middle of learning the 3rd weapon system when the comm panel lit up with an incoming signal. Karathi frequency, military band, priority transmission. They had detected the power signature when Az went fully active. Of course they had. A 2,000-kilometer vessel drawing on a power source unlike anything in the known registry does not do so quietly, and the Karathi had been listening to this region of space for reasons that I was, by that point, beginning to understand. The message was short. Standard challenge format. Identify, power down, and prepare for boarding, or face immediate destruction. I looked at the message for a moment. Then I looked at Az. Az showed me the incoming fleet on the sensor display. 40 ships, military configuration. Heavy armament, by Karathi standards, which were considerable. They were moving in a hammer formation, widespread, designed to prevent any vessel from breaking through the perimeter by sheer coverage of angles. It was a good formation. It was designed for everything in the known registry. Sweet mother of torque, I said. The lights went amber and waiting. I cracked my knuckles, a sound that echoed through the bridge in a way I found disproportionately satisfying, and I sat down in the command chair. It fit me exactly. It should not have. It was built for a Veth. which was a species that was neither human in proportion, nor human in the particular way a body settles into a chair it considers its own. It fit me exactly anyway, the way the Copperhead's pilot seat fit me exactly despite being a standard-issue commercial model. Because some things accommodate you not through design but through use, through the slow impression of a person on a space that learns them over time. Az had been learning me for 11 years. "All right," I said. "Let us see what you have got." They came out of their formation at 300,000 kilometers and split into 7 groups. Standard Karathi assault configuration, which their military had been using for 80 years, because it worked, and they were not a species that discarded things that worked. Each group was assigned a quadrant of approach. The mathematics of it were designed to prevent any single vessel target from maneuvering effectively in any direction without moving toward at least 2 of the groups. I opened the comm before any of them fired. "This is Mara Voss," I said. "Salvage contractor, Earth Registry 77 Copperhead. I am giving you one opportunity to turn around." The fleet commander's laugh came back across the open channel. Not a private channel. An open one, broadcast to every ship in his formation. The specific kind of laugh that a person uses when they want an audience for their contempt. I noted the timestamp. I filed it. He told me that I was operating an unregistered vessel in restricted space, that the vessel in question was subject to immediate confiscation under Karathi territorial law, and that my cooperation would be noted favorably in the subsequent proceedings. He said proceedings the way people say it when they mean something that is not actually a proceeding in any meaningful sense. I closed the channel. I asked Az to show me the first weapon system again. The Veth had not named their weapons the way military cultures usually do, not with words that meant destruction or power or threat. They named them with words that described function at a physical level, what the mechanism did to the space around it, how it interacted with matter and energy. The first system's name translated roughly as the separator, which was accurate in a way that I spent a moment not dwelling on before I engaged it. 6 Karathi ships. Gone. Not destroyed in the way that produces debris fields and heat signatures and the slow-spreading cloud of what a vessel used to be. Separated. The space they occupied renegotiated in the same fundamental way Az's drive renegotiated distance, except applied locally and briefly, which was enough. The remaining 34 ships held their formation for 4 seconds. I counted. 4 seconds of a fleet deciding what to do with information that did not fit any category its tactical database contained. Then they adapted. The Karathi were not a species that panicked easily, and they were not a species that gave up a military objective without being forced to, which I had known for 3 years, and which I respected in the distant way you respect a thing you are going to have to go through. They deployed the boarding complement. 30 soldiers in hardened assault suits, launched from 3 different ships simultaneously, approaching from vectors designed so that any weapon that stopped one group would be out of position for the others. Az sealed them into the corridor before I asked it to. It looked at me. I looked back at it, which is a strange thing to say about a ship, but Az had a quality of attention that made the word looking feel accurate. There was a question in the quality of the silence it offered me. I made the decision. It was not a difficult decision. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. The soldiers were contained. Az had alternatives to destruction, that the Veth had engineered specifically because they understood that killing as a first response was a failure of imagination. I told Az what I wanted. Az did it. The soldiers were returned to their ships, suits intact, in a condition that I will describe as significantly reminded of their own vulnerability. 24 ships remained when the Karathi fleet broke. I watched them go. 16 I let go without any action. 8. I stopped with the separator, not fully, not finally, but enough. Engines gone, life support intact, weapons offline, drifting, alive, unable to follow. Because I was sending a message, not winning an argument. I opened the comm to the 16 ships that were running. "Go home," I said. "Tell them what you saw, not what I did not do." I closed the channel. The Karathi commander's private channel opened 30 seconds later. The laugh was completely gone from his voice. He asked what I was. I told him I was a mechanic from Detroit. I closed that channel too. Az hummed around me. Not a sound exactly, more like the feeling of a very large thing settling into itself after a long period of unnecessary tension. I put my hand on the command panel and felt the warmth of it, and I thought about Owen and Claire and Sam and Diane and the Karathi cruiser that had come at them 3 years ago on a border that no one had officially declared a conflict zone. I thought about the commander's laugh on the open channel, the audience he had wanted for it. I was not angry. I noticed that I was not angry, and I sat with it for a moment, examining it the way you examine a repair to make sure it has held, and what I found where the anger should have been was something quieter and more precise. A thing that knew where it was going and was not in a hurry because it was very sure of arriving. Az brought the amber lights up to full. "Good girl," I said. The warmth in the panel under my hand increased by a degree too small to measure. I pulled up the galactic political map and started reading about the Dominari Collective, because the Karathi fleet had transmitted before they fired, which meant someone else already knew Az was awake, and the Karathi were not the most dangerous call I was going to receive. They were just the fastest. The most dangerous call came 18 hours later. It was not a call. It was a formal diplomatic transmission, threaded through 6 relay stations and authenticated by 3 different galactic bodies, and it requested my presence at an emergency session of the Galactic Concord. The same organization that Callow had mentioned when he listed the watch registries, the same organization whose member species had, 11 years before the Karathi border conflict, voted in a closed session to maintain what they called strategic instability in frontier regions, by occasionally permitting engagements that removed human vessels with minimal deniability. I had learned this from Az's archive on day 5. I had not written it in my personal log. I had fixed a completely functional atmospheric recycler instead, 3 times, very thoroughly. The transmission gave me 72 hours to respond. I spent 48 of them in Az's lower engine bays, not because anything needed attention, but because I needed to think, and thinking happened in my hands first, and my head second, always had. And the Veth drive system was the most intellectually demanding piece of machinery I had ever encountered, and it gave my hands enough to do, that my head could work quietly in the background. On the 3rd day I accepted the transmission. I told them I would come. I told Az to set course for the Concord Central Station, a structure called the Convergence, which orbited a star in the neutral zone, and had been the seat of galactic governance for 400 years, and which had, in that time, made exactly 3 decisions that I would have described as genuinely fair. Az set the course without my needing to specify it. It already knew where the convergence was. It had been tracking the Concord's activities for as long as it had been tracking mine. I went to the archive room and asked Az to show me everything it had on the Concord's founding. I sat on the floor and read for 12 hours. By the end, I was not angry about what I found. I want to be clear about that. Anger was not the right tool for it. The way a torque wrench is not the right tool for a delicate calibration. What I felt was something closer to the recognition you get when a repair you have been puzzling over suddenly reveals its own logic, and you understand not just what is broken, but why it broke, and what it was going to keep doing until someone fixed it properly. The Concord was not a government. It was a cartel, dressed in the language of governance, and it had been managing the galaxy the way a dam manages a river, not for the benefit of the water, but for the benefit of the people who decided where the water went. The founding documents were honest about this in the way that very old documents sometimes are, before the people who made the decisions had enough time to make the language more comfortable. I asked Az to prepare the full archive for external broadcast. Az held the request in the way it held things it wanted me to consider further, a slight hesitation in the system, a quality of pause. "Not yet," I told it, "but soon." The lights stayed amber. I stood up and stretched and went to find my coffee thermos, because I was going to walk into the most powerful diplomatic body in the known galaxy in 30 hours, and I was going to need to be the most rested, most focused, most mechanically precise version of myself that existed, and that version ran on coffee, and on the specific kind of calm that comes from understanding a problem well enough to know exactly where to apply pressure. I found the thermos. I filled it. Then I went back to the bridge and watched the stars move, as Az carried me toward the center of everything, patient and warm, and 2,000 kilometers of waiting to be understood, and I thought that the Veth would have found this moment very interesting. I thought they would have approved of the mechanic they picked. The convergence was enormous in the way that deliberate statements of power are enormous, built to make the beings inside it feel small, so that the institution itself felt large. 7 spires of composite material arranged around a central sphere, each spire housing the delegation of a different founding species, the whole structure designed so that no single spire was higher than any other, which was the Concord's most visible lie rendered in architecture. I had read enough of their history by the time Az docked at the designated bay to know that equality of height had never translated to equality of anything else. I walked into the main chamber with my toolbox. Not because I intended to fix anything in there. Habit. The toolbox went where I went. The Concord security detail at the entrance, 4 Dominari in formal enforcement armor, looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at the ship that had docked outside their station, and made the practical decision. The chamber was built to hold representatives from hundreds of species, and it currently held perhaps 60. The rest had sent remote delegates, which meant holographic presences shimmering in their assigned seats, and the effect was of a room that was both very full and very empty at the same time. Full of images, empty of commitment. The lead negotiator was a Dominari named Veth Oral, which I found interesting given what I knew about what the Dominari had done to the actual Veth, and I kept that observation to myself. He was 7 feet tall, and his 3 sets of eyes tracked independently, which meant he could watch 6 different things at once, and his voice had a quality of resonance that I suspected was partly architectural and partly deliberate, tuned to produce a specific neurological response in most species that translated to automatic deference. I offered him coffee before he could speak. He looked at the thermos for a long moment. He did not know what it was. This seemed to bother him more than the 2,000-kilometer warship docked outside his station, which told me something useful about his priorities. The Concord's position was delivered in formal diplomatic language that took 40 minutes to say 3 things. First, the vessel designated Ajkara was prohibited under the Veil Accords, a treaty signed by all founding species 400 years ago. Second, operating a prohibited vessel was a violation of galactic law. Third, surrendering the vessel and cooperating with Concord authority would result in no charges being filed against me personally. I waited until he finished. Then I told him I had read the Veil Accords. He confirmed that I had, presumably, been provided access to the public version. I told him I had read the full version, the version in Az's archive, the one that included the 12 addenda that had never been made public, the ones that specified what the founding species were actually agreeing to prohibit and why, and more specifically, the ones that detailed what the founding species had done in the 3 years before the accords were signed, to ensure that the most significant potential challenge to their authority would no longer be in a position to object to anything. Veth Oral was silent. The chamber was silent. I opened the archive feed. Az broadcast it through the chamber's own display system, which it had connected to during the docking process in a way that the Concord's technical team had apparently not noticed until this moment, and the screens that were designed to display diplomatic credentials and formal motions filled instead with the founding records of the Precautionary Alliance. I did not explain it. I did not narrate it. I let it speak in the voices of the people who had made the decisions, in the languages of the 7 species who had sat in rooms very much like this one, and voted on what to do about the Veth, and I stood at the center of the chamber with my toolbox beside me, and watched their descendants watch their ancestors be honest about what they had done. The records were thorough. The Veth had been thorough. Every transmission, every vote, every classified military order, every diplomatic communication, in which the founding species had discussed the Veth in the language they used when they thought no one was listening. Languages like, too capable. Languages like, the risk is unacceptable. Languages like, before they become something we cannot manage. The chamber stayed silent for a very long time, after the last record finished playing. Veth Oral said the archive could not be authenticated. Az authenticated it. It cross-referenced every document against the sealed historical archives of all 7 founding species, archives that were not public, archives that should not have been accessible to any external system, archives that Az had apparently had quiet access to for several centuries because the Veth had built into their ship a capability for exactly this kind of long and patient record-keeping. Each document came up confirmed, each signature verified, each date and location and signatory name checked against multiple independent sources and returned without discrepancy. The chamber was very quiet. In the back, In the section reserved for non-voting observer species, a small holographic presence shimmered with more intensity than it had shown since the session began. The Yeth, a prey-class species, as the Concord's own documents referred to them, a designation that told you everything you needed to know about how the founding species thought about the beings they were governing. The Yeth had been under Concord protection for 200 years, which in practice meant that the Concord decided where the Yeth could travel, what they could build, and which of their resources were available for collective use. Collective meaning the founding seven. The Yeth delegate opened a private channel to me. "What do you want from us?" the message read. I thought about it. I thought about it with the same attention I give a complex repair, not rushing toward an answer, mapping the problem first, understanding the full shape of what was broken before I touched anything. What I wanted was my crew back. That was the truth of it. Owen and Claire and Sam and Diane, 3 years gone, in a border conflict that Az's archive had shown me was not an accident, not a miscalculation, but a managed event, one of dozens in the past century, engineered instability in regions where human expansion was beginning to intersect uncomfortably with Karathi interests, that the Concord had guaranteed, in exchange for the Karathi's founding membership. I could not have that. So, I told Vethoral that I wanted accountability, a real process, not a diplomatic one, with actual consequences for decisions that had been made, and actual remediation for the species that had been living under management for 200 years, while the founding seven decided what they were allowed to do with their own planets, and their own resources, and their own futures. I told him I wanted the Concord to open its actual records, not the public versions, to a commission made up of the non-founding species, the ones who had been on the receiving end of the management. I told him that was the whole ask. Vethoral looked at me for a long time with all 6 of his eyes. Then he asked if there was a threat implicit in the request. I picked up my toolbox. I told him that I was a mechanic. Mechanics did not make threats. They identified what was broken, and they explained what would happen if it was not fixed, and they let the owner of the machine make the decision. The machine in question was Galactic governance. What would happen if it was not fixed was something he could probably work out from the archive he had just watched, and the decision was his. I went to sit down. 3 species withdrew their formal Concord membership before the session was officially adjourned. Not the 3 I would have predicted. Not the ones who had seemed most agitated during the archive presentation. The ones who had been quietest, who had watched with the particular stillness of people calculating very quickly, who had done their math and arrived at the conclusion that the structure they were in was no longer the safest structure to be standing in. Vethoral asked for the coffee before I left. I handed him the thermos. He drank it wrong in a way that I could tell, but I did not correct him, because he kept drinking it anyway, and there was something in that. Something about the willingness to continue with a thing you did not fully understand, because it was clearly doing something worthwhile, that I found I could not disagree with. On my private channel, Az sent me something. Not words, not coordinates, a feeling, old and slow and enormous, like a tide that had been building for a very long time, and was now, at last, arriving at the shore it had always been moving toward. It felt like, this is what I waited for. I sat in the chamber with my toolbox beside me, and the Concord fracturing around me along stress lines I could have mapped 3 days ago, and I thought about the Veth in their archive room, the names pressed into the walls at a molecular level, the civilization that had been careful enough to save its own memory into the bones of its last ship before the end came. They had not built Az for vengeance. They had built it for exactly this, for the moment when the record was finally read by someone willing to read it, and the reading of it changed the room. I had fixed a lot of things in my life. This was the strangest repair I had ever attempted. I thought it might be holding. 7 months after the convergence session, 3 factions sent me formal offers. The Karathi Reformation Council, which had formed in the aftermath of the 40-ship incident and the archive broadcast, and was busy rewriting its own history in real time, offered me a military alliance and trade access, and a formal apology that I suspected had been written by someone who had never personally apologized for anything. The Dominari Successor Council, which was what was left of the Concord's dominant species after Vethoral and 6 other senior members, resigned in what their press office called voluntary restructuring, and what Az's archive documented as a very rapid series of private conversations among people who had read the record and understood that being publicly associated with it was now a liability, offered me a seat on a new governing body they were proposing, one with equal representation for all species, which was a good idea, and I did not trust a single word of it. Earth's government offered me an admiral's commission and a formal military designation for Az, which would make it a human warship under Earth's authority, and give me a rank and a salary and a support structure and the specific kind of institutional belonging that I had not had since I lost my crew. I did not answer any of them for 6 days. I spent those 6 days in Az's lower hull. There was nothing wrong in the lower hull. I had been over every system in that section twice, and I had found 2 minor inefficiencies in the secondary pressure regulation, and 1 coolant pathway that was operating at 94% of optimal, and I had fixed all 3 of them in the first 2 days, and then I kept going back, because my hands needed something to do while my head worked. The Veth drive hummed under my palms at a frequency that had become familiar, that I had catalogued in my personal log as the ship's resting tone, the sound of Az being comfortable in itself, which was a very unmechanical way to describe a vibration frequency, and which I included in the log anyway because accuracy mattered more to me than professionalism of language. On the 4th day I found the room. I had been through most of Az by that point. 2,000 kilometers is an enormous amount of ship, but Az had been guiding me through it methodically, opening access to sections as I demonstrated understanding of the systems that preceded them, the way a very careful teacher works through material, in a sequence that builds rather than overwhelms. There were still sections I had not been shown. I had assumed they were more advanced weapon systems, more complex drive mechanics, things Az was waiting until I had the framework to understand. The room was none of those things. It was at the physical center of the ship, accessible through a corridor that Az had not pointed to before, and the door opened when I approached it, the way all Az's doors opened for me, without contact, with a quality of welcome that I had stopped consciously noticing, and which hit me freshly now because of what was inside. The Veth Memorial. Every name, every individual recorded in Az's archive, every Veth who had lived and built and thought and worked and died in the years before the Coalition came. They were not written on the walls in any script I could read. They were present in the room as frequency, as vibration, as a quality of the air that was not sound but was perceived by the body as sound, the way very low notes are felt in the chest rather than heard by the ears. Standing in the room felt like standing in a crowd that was not there. I stood still for a long time. I thought about the Detroit orbital yards and my mother's hands. I thought about the first time I understood what a working engine felt like from the inside, the way a functional system has a coherence to it that a broken one lacks, a rightness of relationship between its parts that you can feel before you can measure. I thought about 4 names that I recited every morning, like a practice, not a prayer, a practice, the way a mechanic practices a skill they cannot afford to forget. Owen, Claire, Sam, Diane. I did not cry. This is not a statement about strength. It is a statement about the specific way grief settles into the body after 3 years, the way it stops being a wave and becomes a material, something you are built around, something structural. I stood in the memorial room with 2 civilizations' worth of loss pressing against me from the walls, and I understood something that I had been working toward for 7 months without having the right words for it. The Veth had not built Az to start something. They had built it to survive long enough to be understood. They had built it in the hope that someday, someone would stand in this room and know what had happened and carry that knowledge forward into a galaxy that had agreed to forget it, and the carrying forward would matter. Not because it would fix what had been done, nothing was going to fix what had been done, but because a thing that is known is different from a thing that is not known, and the difference has consequences, and the consequences compound over time, and time is the one resource the Veth had been willing to spend freely. They had spent thousands of years of it. Az had spent thousands of years of it. On me. I went back to the bridge on day 6, and I called Earth Command back. No, I said. They asked what I meant to do. I told them I was going to do something the Veth did not get to do, stick around long enough to be a problem. Then I told them what I actually proposed, which was not a nation's warship, and not a diplomatic instrument, and not a weapon pointed at any specific target. Az was not mine to assign. I had understood that since day 1, Since the bridge. Since the question the ship had asked me without words. Az had not asked me, "Are you willing to take command?" It had asked me, "Are you the one who fixes things?" Those were different questions, with different answers, and different consequences. I proposed registering Az as a sovereign vessel under the new galactic framework that the Yeth and 11 other previously managed species were in the process of constructing, with the assistance of the Concord's opened archives. I proposed Az as an independent intelligence with recognized status under that framework, and I proposed my own position aboard it, not as captain or commander or admiral, as crew. The mechanic. Earth Command was quiet for a long time. Then they asked if I was serious. I told them I had never been anything but serious. They asked what Az thought of this. I asked Az. Az showed me the star chart with the marker at the Yeth colony. Then it expanded the chart to show 17 other locations, other non-founding species home systems, other places where the managed had been living under the management for long enough that they had stopped being able to imagine anything else. Then it showed me the routes between them, not military routes, not trade routes, the routes a vessel would take if it was moving between those places because it intended to be present in all of them, because presence was a kind of protection that was different from the protection offered by a weapon, because being seen and being known and being reachable was a thing that the managed species had been specifically denied, and the denial had been deliberate. Az had not waited 11 years for a weapon. It had waited for someone who understood the difference between a hammer and a wrench. I told Earth Command that Az was in favor of the plan. They approved it 2 weeks later, mostly because the alternative was a 2,000-kilometer vessel operating independently in galactic space with no institutional affiliation, which made every government in the galaxy nervous in ways that were good for no one. The approval came with a long list of conditions and requests and preferred communication protocols, and I filed it under reading material for a later date, and moved on. The night before we left for the Yeth colony, I sat on the bridge in the command chair and did what I had not done since I arrived at the ship 7 months ago. I was still. Not working. Not thinking through a system or a problem or a route. Just still. Az was still with me. The amber lights were low and warm, and the Veth drive hummed at its resting frequency, and somewhere in the walls, the memorial room held its quiet crowd, and outside the viewport, the Veil Nebula spread its colors across a darkness so full of things that the word empty had never applied to it. I recited the names: Owen, Claire, Sam, Diane. I did not know what came after that. I had been reciting them as an ending, as a period at the close of a sentence that did not have anything after it, and sitting here now, I noticed that the sentence was not finished, that it was still going, that they were not the end of it. They were part of why it was still being written. Az sent me a feeling. Not the vast, slow tide of the convergence moment, something smaller and more specific. The feeling of a system that has been running in low-power mode for a very long time, finally drawing full current. The feeling of a mechanism that has been waiting for its purpose to arrive and has now found it and is operating, at last, within the full tolerance of what it was designed to do. The feeling of a repaired thing. Whole. In the morning I checked the coolant relay in the lower hull, the one I had already fixed twice, because I was a mechanic, and checking things was not obsession, it was methodology. The relay was functioning at 100% of optimal. I adjusted a setting that did not need adjusting, and moved it back, and closed the panel. Then I went to the bridge. "All right," I said. "What is next?" Az pointed. Amber light, ahead, steady and warm, and I followed it the way I had followed it on the first day, because some instincts are built into you before you know what they are for, and mine had always been to move toward the thing that needed fixing. The Copperhead floated in her docking bay, 40 meters long, and smelling of hydraulic fluid, and a loneliness that was beginning to feel, slightly, less total. 2,000 kilometers of the most powerful vessel in galactic history moved into the dark. And its mechanic went with it. Not because she had been chosen, because she had chosen. And in the end, that was the only difference that had ever mattered.